In the history of what sport in the universe has the sport retained someone who tries the sport for the first time at 80%? No sport ever.
All these retailers that had been talking about how confident they are about next year, rapidly losing confidence.
We just received a container of this Grupo that we've had on back order for months. When we called our customers, none of the business was there because the other distributor had gotten their container a couple days earlier.
All of these bikes that were waiting on something, now that something has now finally started to arrive. You need to take these. You ordered them. Here they are.
Trying to do it in a conservative way so that you don't get caught holding the bag eventually.
The more understanding as an industry that we have of where we stand, the more we're going to be able to do a better job to work through this together.
We heard in episode 1, The Feast, about the unexpected windfall that the cycling industry saw during the start of the pandemic and how it reacted. Of course, that didn't last forever, and in this episode, we talk about the early signs of this new demand that was coming to an abrupt halt, and the types of behavior that was happening, and the causes of that behavior that led to the catastrophe that the bike industry would later see. To start off with, here's Ellery Slater again from Sports Garage Independent Bike Shop.
I am going to share this because I heard it. Like I actually heard it said. We attended a product reveal during the pandemic. And of course, the conversation came around to like, how do we keep getting bikes? What do you need us to do? Like, what should we do about 2022? Are you going to have bikes? How much should I order? Like we were starting to ask our manufacturers questions about 2022. Like we had to turn in a preseason order, but we had nothing remotely normal against which to gauge what was going to happen. And we'd just been through this intense experience of like not getting bikes. And so we're thinking, well, okay, here's our forecast. How many units do we need to meet our own sales goal? Where are we going to get those units? It was told to us that, so we're a top 10 buyer. And I was curious about how the buyers ranked higher than us were doing. And we were told, well, just, we're getting about, however much percent of what we order. So we just kind of inflate, we're going to inflate the order and so that we can get as much as we can. And like, we're going to, we're delivering at about X% right now. And they were like, just roll deep, order more and get in the front of the line. You can always cancel it later if you don't need it, but like put your units in so that you've got all these units in there. Cause in case we get Model A, you've got orders in the system for Model A and we're going to ship them to you. And maybe if we happen to get Model B, then you're going to get shipped Model B, right? So we did. We increased what we ordered dramatically. And so did other like-minded dealers. Like, all right, we got to roll deep. We got to get the bikes. So if you are we were instructed by our vendor partner to just order more, get in the front of the line, cancel it later if you don't need it. So if you multiply that over hundreds of dealers, then dealers started canceling orders. But, I was told someone said to me, manufacturers are in the situation they're in because dealers canceled orders. And I'm like, dealers canceled orders because we were told to roll deep and then trim if we needed to. So I don't know what was happening in planning and purchasing departments, but at the moment in time that a manufacturer saw that they had already grown by 30, 40, 50, 60%, I don't know how much they grew. Like manufacturers grew tremendously, right? And then they see a back order for even that much more. Didn't someone throw a red flag and go, hey, are these back orders real?
Right.
Are dealers really going to take all this product? And I mean, I don't know. I've never been in the purchasing department at a manufacturer, but to me, the numbers got so big. And even if you scale it in our business and we looked at the numbers like on a percentage basis, they were insane. And we canceled a lot of orders.
At this point in time, when this was the mindset and dealers were being told this, were orders starting to flow? Was supply starting to be less constrained, or was still supply really hard to get your hands on? I imagine it would have been by your message.
Yeah, it was still pretty hard to get your hands on.
Right.
I would say things really, things really started to break loose later in 2022. But, you and I started the conversation with uncertainty and cautious optimism in March of 2020. And if you think about the intensity of delivering that product for, let's call it 20 months, you're like, what next? Right.
Yeah.
We were asked in 2021 by Rocky Mountain to turn in, it was about April of 2021. We were asked to turn in our order for all of 2022.
Yep.
Okay. It's, usually we would have placed that order late summer. Like typically, like, your order window, usually it's like July, August, you're ordering for the next year. So they're getting ahead of it. This didn't seem unreasonable. They were back in June. And in June, they asked us to place our order for all of 2023.
Wow.
Right. So we've written our order for 2022, total guess. They're back 2 months later to order for 2023, even though we don't know how much 22 product we're actually going to get, nor do we have any idea whether we're going to sell it.
In your mind, are you feeling a bit of pressure? We have to get in here, otherwise we've missed the boat and we're going to have nothing?
Absolutely. If you are a dealer and you put yourself emotionally back in that situation of like, if you can't deliver the bike, the reason that I said, send me the bike even without the wheels, you may have made the sale.
Yeah.
Maybe you took a small deposit, right? You got to pay your payroll.
Yeah.
You don't actually get paid on that bike till you put it in the consumer's hands, unless you're and all these things were discussed. Oh, we have to take full payment up front. We have to take a 50% deposit. Like, we talked about all the different things we thought we would have to do. But the real issue, and I know this was an issue for manufacturers as well, you cannot convert bikes to cash without a bike.
Yeah.
So if you were really, like, let's say in like small T trauma daily about getting bikes, you definitely got the sense of like, I'll get in line. I'll get in line. At one point in time, I remember this because we were like, okay, we have to take a vacation. So we decided to go to Hawaii, like everyone else in America, right? Because we could get to Hawaii.
Yeah.
When Hawaii opened. And I remember that we were looking at like, we were still logging in from our vacation and looking at like work orders in the system. And we had said, okay, finally, we've whittled this down. But I remember in April of 2021, we had 81 carbon full suspension bikes that we had received deposits and that were technically in the queue, meaning we were waiting to receive the bike and then build the bike and deliver the bike. 81 full suspension carbon mountain bikes.
And for reference, what would that typically be in a normal year?
I think before that, the highest we'd ever had where it was like, oh, we don't have the bike yet, or we can't fit it in the stand. Like, it's just really busy. Like we got to we'd bring in some contracted labor to build bikes when things would get busy. I think the longest that list had ever been in the history of our shop was like 18. Like, we're 18 sold bikes deep.
Is that right?
Oh my gosh, we've got 18 bikes in the queue. Like, we better make sure the service department is super tight for the next week and a half. But 81?
And how long did this crazy behavior and mode of operating last before things just started not to feel right in terms of demand starting to slide?
I think it's interesting that you asked the question, things not to feel right about demand sliding. Let's be really honest that it should have felt like we need to be careful. This isn't quite right how we're doing business right now.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I think the reason I'm saying that is because I think everyone knows today that the amount of inventory in the cycling industry, on-hand inventory, whether it's at a dealer or at a manufacturer, is an unprecedentedly high number right now.
Yeah.
Right? So I think the real question that we're trying to get to as we work through time, the reason this is a relevant conversation today is because how did we get here?
Yeah.
We're talking about demand sliding. Sliding from what? A high that we thought was sustainable?
Yeah.
A number we thought we were going to keep doing? Relative to a 1, 3, 5-year forecast that we would have done back in 2018? Sliding from what? And has demand really dropped off that much? relative to the number of bikes that we sold? I mean, we're kind of asking the wrong questions. Did new people stop joining the sport? Right? Because we remember the $1,500 to $3,500 bikes? Guess what, Wade? Johnny and Susie started playing soccer again, and mommy can go back to her yoga class. What did manufacturers think was going to happen with those people? Did they think everyone was going to keep coming into the sport at that same rate?
Was the rhetoric around that gateway of people moving more into the sport?
Oh, yeah.
There was.
I had a national sales manager I visited with once say the sport is going to retain 80% of those riders. And they're all going to want to upgrade because they're going to love it. They're going to fall in love and they're going to upgrade.
Right.
In the history of what sport in the universe has the sport retained someone who tries the sport for the first time at 80%? Says no sport ever. We kept thinking, no, like a realistic number, research-backed number based on the adoption of outdoor sports, based on behavior, based on context. Brad and I kept going, I think it's more like 10% or less. I think we even at one point in time said 3% of the people that bought a bike under $3,500 will upgrade sometime in the next 2 years. 10% will stay in the sport. Maybe 3% will become enthusiastic and upgrade someday. And manufacturers were like, no, we're going to retain like 80% of these people are going to stay in the sport. And I'm like, where'd you come up with that number? I'm like, you are reading your own press, or maybe just like wanting to believe that story because you somehow need to validate the order you just placed with your Pacific Rim manufacturing vendor, right?
Yeah.
It didn't make sense to say that we would stay on this continual upward trajectory. I mean, if people just slow down and think about their own experience, slow down and think about what was happening in the lives of the people that chose to buy bikes for their family when they couldn't go to the gym. Like, what behaviors did you have during COVID that were COVID specific behaviors that you don't have anymore?
You mentioned the IBDs in the middle, the ones that would have had to make those tough choices. They were the ones getting into a lot of trouble, I imagine, by responding to the demand and needing to be opportunistic. I imagine from what you've described your market as, you were fortunate in that, okay, you weren't just going to, you didn't feel like you were going to take that 80%. So you could maybe take comfort in that you didn't have all this inventory or stock or demand that wasn't going to continue, but you were still swept up in the better place your orders, better.
Yes.
Otherwise, you would have nothing potentially.
Totally. And we were, I will say, I'm not going to say we did everything perfectly. Of course, we got a little swept up. And of course, we were a little nervous. And we started 2023 with twice as much inventory as we normally would have. And we did not like it. We did not feel comfortable.
Right.
And our level of inventory was lower than many of our colleagues. But when we looked at our balance sheet and we were like, is this a healthy balance sheet? We were like, this is not comfortable. We have heard horrifying stories of how much inventory people got, right? Because remember when we had in the conversation, the getting swept up in, get in line is the message, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, what if you got swept up in and you got in line and you forgot which line you got in? And then one day, 900 bikes showed up. And that happened, Wade. That happened. We have a colleague out of state, 4 states away, that has a storage unit with 900 bikes in it.
Now that we've heard from Ellery, who is on the ground seeing what's actually happening, and with pressure coming from the brands down to the bike shops, here's another perspective. This is Tae Huang again from Quality Bicycle Products, or QBP, the largest distributor in the US, where he was a forecasting analyst during the pandemic. Now, for those of you familiar with the supply chain in the bike industry, the distributor sits in the middle between the brands and the dealer network. But many brands who are already established in the market often don't use distributors, so it's not completely clear-cut. But for your own reference, QBP distributes the likes of SRAM, Shimano, and over 250 other brands in the US, as well as owning some of their own house brands.
Internally, I don't think I ever heard anyone say this is the new normal. The sense in the building was pretty uniformly, we need to take advantage of this while we can. increase our POs, call in all the favors, get the product in, but keep your hand on the stop button, right? Just hover, right?
Yeah.
So we were watching sales, we were looking at different sales trends to see how things were shifting. And then, like I said, we had those surveys that were going out on a monthly cadence from, I want to say, mid 2021 through early 2022.
These are the shop surveys.
Yeah, watching and seeing if there was a shift that would tell us to stop.
The forecast demand planning, was this a huge increase that you were committed to during this time for the next year, and were you forced to even order beyond next year too?
Late 2022, you may have seen a bunch of SRAM access sales kicking off, at least stateside. Those were the result of SRAM agreeing to go on some pricing holidays for the entire US dealer base, because they did what we call a blind ship, which is when you ship a pre-order without any approval or confirmation. And pretty much what happened is all those orders those retailers were submitting through 2020, 2021, 2022 that SRAM couldn't fulfill, when all that product finally became available in late 2022, they pushed it out the door. I get that the retailer placed the order. It's the retailer's responsibility to track those orders and make sure those POs should still be open. But some of those POs were dang near 2 years old.
Right.
They should have at least done some courtesy calls. And they just kicked out millions of dollars of product in a matter of weeks.
Shipping them directly to the shops.
Exactly. Yeah, directly to the shop stores. And normally those shops would never be ordering direct from SRAM because their quantities would never be high enough to necessitate it, right?
Right.
Like SRAM does do big orders, but it's not their business to handle weekly orders from retailers. They're trying to get into it, but I mean, that's a big expense to set up something like that. And so these retailers were desperate. They couldn't get that product from Q. They couldn't get it from J&B. They couldn't get it from Holly. So they placed these orders with SRAM with just kind of the attitude of, we'll get it when we get it, and then promptly forgot about them, right?
Right.
So like, talk about a horizon. That's what we're talking about here, right? Like product showing up 18 months, 24 months after you asked for it. And that is frankly what I'm assuming what most at least distributors and manufacturers are sitting on now. It's the stuff that they placed orders for over a year ago that they just did not have the ability to cancel. I recall us slowing down our purchase orders again well before 2022 started, but just the tail on those orders was so long,
right,
that we were still getting product into 2023 well after our sales no longer supported having new product come in.
Someone was telling me what retailers or would often do as well is they might, if there's two SRAM distributors, they might order an order from one and an order from another, and then they both would show up.
Yeah.
Basically 50% over ordering just to hedge their bets. Right.
Our sales reps, because they weren't primarily tasked with selling P&A, and what they were tasked with selling was product we didn't have a lot of stock in, they were mostly spending their time just helping retailers find inventory.
Huh.
I directly compare that to some of our competitors, other distributors that definitely did hire contractors, so folks who are paid based off of what they sell, whereas our reps were all salaried. And so those groups would employ, we call it count and fill. So the rep would show up and then literally do an inventory check on the wall or inventory count for their whatever brands that they carry. Then would pop open their laptop, log into that customer's account, put all the fill inventory into a cart and just turn it around and say, hey, press go, right? I guarantee you those guys were putting in 80-hour weeks doing as many count and fills as they could during that time period, right? Just like filling up those retailers' stocks right when those surveys, late 2021, were already coming back to me and retailers saying, no, I'm going slim into 2023.
You were sending out these surveys, and what was the purpose of them?
Yeah, the purpose was really just to see if we could figure out what the stopping point would be.
Right. You guys were anticipating an end at some point, so you thought, let's do continuous surveys to get a feel when to put your hand on the stop button. So how were those surveys going initially when you first started them?
Yeah, I mean, free freight is always a great way to get retailer responses. And there was a lot of retailers, late summer 2021, I think is when we started. Best year I've ever had. Each month is better than the last. I don't expect the foot traffic to slow down. I'm excited about next month. And then, we asked about different categories. How's your road traffic compared to last year? How's your mountain business? How's your kids' business? And so we got as granular as we thought we could. And it was a group of analysts and then purchasing side folks that kind of put our heads together to come up with the broadest picture that we possibly could of things.
Right.
With the anticipation that, it would tell us what's happening maybe in one category or not in another. And we definitely saw that, really the stopping point was not necessarily that the results were telling us that the COVID boom was over. It was just retailers were no longer willing to fill out the survey anymore. I think the last survey we had less than a dozen retailers respond.
And what was the time of this approximately?
I'd say spring of 2022.
So no one got back to you, and and that was a bit of the defining moment where you thought that something was turning around.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It was, partially they had responded to a dozen of these things. Partially it was, it's the start of the season, so it's probably ramping up. But hindsight being 2020, it was probably also because it was pretty depressing, right? All these retailers that had been talking about how confident they are about next year, rapidly losing confidence.
This podcast is fully funded by our members at Escape Collective. In fact, all of our content on our website and our podcast network is 100% supported by our members who believe that cycling media should be independent from the sport and industry we cover, and that we should exist to serve you rather than live or die by our ability to be a platform for the sole purpose of selling you more stuff. If you enjoy this podcast or any of our other work and believe in our mission of independence, please go to escapcollective.com/join and become a member today. Thank you for your support. Now, remember the count and sell agents that Tay mentioned a couple minutes ago who were hired on contract? Because Ellery Slater will talk about them in a later episode and the incentives at play that created some of the unintended consequences that led the industry to where it is now. Now, you've probably heard about the bankruptcy of Wiggle Chain Reaction that shook the cycling industry. They were once the world's largest direct-to-consumer online cycling retailer, and seemingly overnight, in November 2023, they collapsed. I spoke to Jake Dudek, who was VP of Commercial Operations at Cigna Sports, the public holding company behind Wiggle CRC. We'll get to the reasons behind the downfall of Cigna in later episodes, but here's Jake's perspective on the leading signals during the pandemic while he was at Wiggle Chain Reaction.
I was thinking about the bike space at that time because the job that I'd been in before that was I was with backcountry and competitive cyclist and had exposure to bike space there. Two thoughts crossed my mind. Like the first was, for sure, one, there's going to be a ramp in participation. And there was, it was like maybe a 10% growth in the year 2020, something like that. The second was, this is going to be a massive demand pull forward. So like, rather than having, say you have this cohort of people, and say they're new participants, we'll just make it simple. So say you have this huge cohort of new participants, and normally they would be staggering their purchases like maybe over a 5-year period. It's just going to align like everything, like all against this phenomenon because everyone's stuck at home. And I think my head immediately went to like, people are definitely going to screw up the procurement on this. Like they are going to think that this is somehow a recurring thing, and they are going to overramp procurement and production, and they're going to bury themselves. And I was thinking that because I was trying to avoid that at all costs, like in my current role, like I was trying to balance like being conservative with procurement and balancing that against, I guess we'd call it almost like an artificial demand. Yes, it's demand, and yes, you're trying to fulfill against it, but you're trying to do it in a conservative way so that you don't get caught holding the bag eventually.
Here's Rob Jatellis from Factor again, speaking from Taiwan, where much of the bicycle industry's hard goods are manufactured.
Well, I think that everybody's starting to see that demand was already starting to slacken in 2022. And I'm speaking from the industry standpoint, not necessarily Factor at that point. Factor was still quite strong through 22, also in 23. But I think from the industry standpoint, I started to hear that, okay, the demand is definitely starting to decrease, but all of these bikes that were waiting on something, now that something has now finally started to arrive. And so those factories now were finally able to complete those orders and tell the brands, okay, you need to take these, you ordered them, here they are. But probably the most important thing was brands like SRAM and Shimano came back to us and said, okay, can you kind of clean up your orders? Can you look and see what you have in the system, what you really want, and we'll give you the opportunity to cancel anything you don't need up until like a certain date. And then anything up until that date, you need to be responsible for it. And so you knew when they came with that policy that obviously everybody was coming to their senses. They didn't want to continue to produce things that they couldn't sell, but they obviously had already produced quite a bit. So they could only cancel those orders that were out into the future. They couldn't cancel the ones that were already in the production.
Now, coming up, pay close attention to the term phantom orders that Josh Portner from Silca later refers to. This is a term that I've heard again and again in my conversations, and it refers to orders that were placed by either bike shops or others up the supply chain that led to the exaggeration of demand.
We're the largest 3D printer of titanium product in cycling, like by far. We print for around 40 customers worldwide. And we really started to notice it from them and hear it from them. And then the other thing we started to notice a little bit from those guys, but from a couple of our big distributors were like Shimano SRAM type distributors also. I had a conversation with someone I've known for 20 years at one of these big distributors, and kind of off the cuff, he said, "Oh God, we just received a 40-foot container of this Grupo that we've had on back order for months. And when we called our customers, none of the business was there because the other distributor had gotten their container a couple days earlier. And all of it was phantom business because all the shops had ordered from both." I kind of got off that and grabbed, my sales team here and said, "Hey guys, I would start calling people and just talk them up, chat them up. What are you feeling? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? If that's happening in that market, that's happening in all the markets. And if that's happening in all the markets, then this whole thing is going to get ugly real quick because all the demand is, at least 50% of the demand is phantom demand at that point. And all we have to do to uncover it is just fulfill one of the halves, and the other half goes away." And it turned out, for probably the 6 to 9 months following that, I bet I heard some version of that story 100 times.
We heard from Tyler Jordan, the CEO of apparel brand 7Mesh, in the last episode, and here he is again.
So I can't wait to listen to the podcast to find out what other people experienced, because for us, reflecting on it, I think I realized that the slowdown was happening late. I think it did impact us later than other people. We were in Q4 of 2022, right? And we'd reduced our forecast for 2022 at that point, but we reduced our forecast from a really great number to a pretty good number. And keep in mind, again, like I said, we were a really small brand, and we're still a small brand. But we still grew really well during 2022 and didn't really feel the decline until halfway through Q4 is when we started to say, hey, wait a minute here, this is starting to get interesting. So again, we'd sold in our orders for our dealers for spring, and they sold in pretty strongly. We hadn't experienced a lot of cancellations. We started to feel like things were a little slower in that time period. And then it was only in Q1 of 2023 that we realized, like, okay, though this is actually really slowing down hard on us now. And again, because we do, a bulk of our business had been wholesale, we were maybe late to get the warning signs because they were coming from our dealers rather than coming from higher up the supply chain. And that's when, dealers started to say, like, oh, okay, I might need to tune back my spring order a little bit. Things are slow or what have you. So, we were doing great percentage growth numbers through 2022 and didn't really feel any pain until 2023.
In Q4 2022, as you say, when you started seeing the signals of demand decreasing, what was in the pipeline of orders at that point?
To answer that question properly, I just first want to say, as a small apparel brand that is, wants to work with great factories and great materials and needs to hit certain minimums to do that, we are always exposed on inventory. So, and in most small apparel brands, depending on their business model, do face that challenge. So we carry a high level of inventory relative to our sales, and we turn it slowly. And so we are already in a situation where, compared to some brands that can run more leanly or efficiently that way, we're kind of exposed. And that's an artifact of the fact, well, that's what we choose to do. And that's a consequence of that we live with. As we saw, in Q4 of 2022, as the business, we're starting to sense that slowdown. What that meant was, if you think November, December of 2022, we were slowing down a little bit from our 22 goal. So we had a bit of extra inventory compared to where we wanted to finish the end of the year, but that's pretty minimal compared to the fact the inventory level is already high, if you will. We had all of our inventory for spring, summer 2023 on a boat or about to get on a plane and, land in Vancouver and come to Squamish. And those have been committed the prior July. And so the ability to adjust at that point is non-existent. We're actually place our orders for fall delivery usually around January. So we had about 30 days to decide how much do you want to build for fall.
Right.
And at that point, when we sell in our fall season, we haven't got all orders from our dealers yet. So we're flying slightly blind. So we are big time committed from a exposure point of view, and we have limited visibility on information. And so it's difficult. And again, that's just the nature of a small business, that we don't have all that, we don't have everybody sell through data, live inventory levels. We don't have all these things you get at bigger and more advanced companies. It's a little bit more seat of the pants, and we have to be comfortable with that.
Is the wholesale model of in your part of the industry with bike shops and that who don't carry good first party data quite often, would that have made a difference to your business if they had, or if this was a 100% D2C business for you?
I think that I should have done a better job making sure I was sensitive to key indicators that could have given me clues at an earlier time. There's information out there that I could have been paying more attention to, or I could have gotten access to here and there. We're small enough that we don't need super detailed data, because we're not going to dive into it and parse it out and figure out sales by region and, identifying smaller opportunities. Like, we're in a mode where we're building products because we think the world needs great products, and we think we can do worthy stuff, and we want to smash a ball out of the park every time and make something awesome and wonderful and innovative. You don't hit that every time, but that's what motivates us every day to go to work. And so we design and build products sometimes aren't that commercial because we think it's the right thing to do. And then there's this mindset afterwards of like, oh, I better figure out whether I can sell these or how many, and we get ourselves into trouble a little bit. We're not naturally plugged into a lot of data because we're not trying to figure out what to build next from, point of sale data. We're more on the leap of faith early stage, where it's like, I can build a better mousetrap, and oh boy, everybody in the world's going to want one of my mousetraps. So if I don't care how many mousetraps Walmart is selling today, because when we give them a better one, holy smokes, they're going to sell a lot more. That's a mindset where that data is only so useful to us. But the early indicator aspect of that would have been super helpful. And right now, I would love to have more access to data about what's actually happening out there, how much inventory people have, when some of these problems will correct itself, because it'll help us make smart decisions as a business and for our partners, for our retail partners and for our raw material suppliers. We all impact each other with the decisions we make. And the more understanding as an industry that we have of where we stand, the more we're going to be able to do a better job to work through this together.
Tyler touches on something very important that we'll get into later, and that is the absence of first-party data in the bicycle industry. First-party data refers to the data collected on the end consumer, or even the amount of inventory a bike shop has and what's sold through. This is where the bike industry is still not very mature, and there's all sorts of data sitting in different systems, which doesn't give a good single view of the end customer. There are many different sales channels and different databases, and none of these layers talk to each other in most cases. As you heard from Tay from QBP talk about, they were relying on surveys to retailers in order to get this information, and they certainly were not real-time views. For many parts of the industry, they were totally flying blind. One high-ranking person from Specialized told me that they saw signs of the demand beginning to wane, but they didn't have the first-party data to back that up. Meanwhile, upper management was pressuring them to increase their forecasts and that this was the new golden age for cycling. The combination of this bullishness within the company's leadership, along with the over-indexing of supply due to retailers fearing they would miss out on their orders, led to a catastrophe. In the next episode, we'll talk about the abrupt slowdown of demand and the disaster that ensued.
I think that it is a call. I think that all of this experience and where we're at today, I think that the real conversation we're having is the bike industry going to see this moment for what it could be, which is an opportunity to get more sophisticated? We have buyers that want to bring in our stuff, but can't right now until they move some other inventory. And so we're in a pretty tough spot playing a bit of a waiting game. And sitting and waiting is not what we're good at, and it's not very comfortable.
Someone with one of the major brands told me they were spending $1 million a month to store their inventory of bikes. And so I don't know how many bikes you have to have in a warehouse that it costs you $1 million in storage fees, but it's a lot.
The consensus within the building was pretty unanimous that what the COVID period had done was just accelerate the bike industry through almost inevitable change that we would have gotten to anyway.